everyone.
Hi.
Hi, Rihanna.
Hi,
Promise.
Promise. Cool, Mira, do you want to introduce? Yeah.
And all our Facebook Live viewers, hello, and welcome to our little A History of Everyone Else teach-in this evening, although midday and other parts of the world, depending on where you are. My name is Mira, and together with my friend, Rihanna, flatmate, university mate, we have set up this platform called A History of Everyone Else to learn and share a bit about the stories of people who are not usually remembered in the way that we learn history. And in the broad, sweeping historical narratives that we typically are brought up to learn. In particular, we feel like there is tons of history of the British Empire and British colonialism, which we as Londoners that have gone to British schools and British universities haven't learned. And that's what really prompted us to spend time learning about topics that we don't know anything about, and then sharing them with you guys in these chatty, informal teach-ins. I'm studying gender studies at the moment, and I have spent the last year thinking about feminism and thinking about anti-racism, and I do believe that it is in believing and thinking that the stories of women, the stories of working class people, the stories of activists, the stories of people who are creatively and bravely challenging structures of power, that those are really meaningful, and they help us understand the world and how it operates. Previously, we've done a teach-in on the Maroons of Jamaica. We've done a teach-in on the impact of the East India Company. But Rihanna's going to tell us a little bit about why we chose today's topic.
Cool. Yeah, thank you, Mira. And yeah, I guess after the Maroons and the East India Company, we were having discussions to discuss what we were going to do next. And as many of you will be aware, just watching the news and seeing a lot of the protests that have been happening in Hong Kong. And I think even since we chose the topic and the last month, so much has happened in terms of the national security law, and just I think I am aware that Hong Kong was a colony of Britain up until 1997. I've been to Hong Kong a few times and spent a few weeks at Hong Kong University on an exchange program, and met a lot of Hong Kongers there, so have been kind of friends with them on Facebook and just seeing a lot of what they've been posting about protest movements and what's going on. So I think, given that this is our platform to kind of take a month at a time, pick a new subject, pick a different piece of history and just learn deeply, Hong Kong, this felt like a good time to learn about Hong Kong. And the point also of this channel is to think about history. So we wanted to understand what's going on today, but also to give ourselves context and know what's happened over the last century or over the last 50 years to have a more informed discussion as well. So I was kind of looking around the internet trying to find a particularly specific moment of history that we could kind of dive into to start the conversation and then broaden out in terms of our understanding of Hong Kong, and came across Promise and Promise's articles, and I came across an article that Promise wrote in The Nation, which was looking at a particular magazine that was created in the early 1970s, and it just felt like I really like art, I like magazines, I like DIY culture and learning about politics through like how young people have created and what they've done, and it just felt like a really interesting piece of history. So I tweeted Promise, and now we're all here together, which is really nice. So maybe, Promise, you can speak and tell us a bit about who you are, the collective that you organize with, and yeah, then we'll start.
Cool. Yeah, thanks for having me again and the invitation. Yeah, I'm Promise Lee. I'm currently a graduate student too. I'm studying British literature. My family background is slightly complicated, and I could go more into that later when we go into the thing. But I'm also an activist and writer and a member of Lausan Collective. We're kind of a left-wing anti-capitalist group that formed kind of right when the protest movement was kind of happening and full blown, almost a year ago from now, where a lot of us, who are Hong Kongers and Chinese folks who are in the diaspora and also in Hong Kong, who want to provide a different type of narrative, right, to the rather polarized binary, right, that the media often kind of give the Hong Kong protests between freedom-loving Western protesters and Chinese authoritarians, and we just kind of want to give more of that nuance while keep providing international solidarity, political exchange for our friends and people who are kind of fighting against state repression in Hong Kong too. So yeah, and I could go into more of that later too in the discussion. But yeah, that's me.
Yay, thank you. Cool. So Mira, do you want to share the schedule and how this will work?
Yeah, I'd love to. So we're going to spend about 5 to 10 minutes setting the scene and a little bit about the history of Hong Kong. Now, we've got no intention of explaining the full history of Hong Kong in 5 to 10 minutes, but we'll just kind of give a bit of context as to the 1970s where we're going to dive deep on. We'll spend about 10 to 15 minutes really on that 1970s radical culture and how young people were opposing the forms of imperialism that they experienced. And then we want to spend about 10 to 15 minutes also chatting on what we think this tells us about today's struggles in Hong Kong, the protests today, but also more broadly what colonialism really means, and what it means to challenge it, to oppose colonialism, and other broad themes about independent media outlets and critiques of capitalism. So we've got some ideas for the kind of themes and ideas that we want to spend 10 to 15 minutes on at the end. So we were going to wrap up latest by 8:45 p.m. for us, 12:45 p.m. in LA. And so we hope that you stay with us for the whole time. When we do get to the end, please do comment and write questions for us in the chat box in Facebook Live. We'd love to pass those on to Promise and get him to share a little bit more about what you guys want to hear about.
Yeah, and also feel free to comment throughout. Even we can see the responses and stuff. So yeah, you're welcome. Cool, nice. So then should we start with this background setting? I think Mira, you're starting us off again with where we're going, and obviously Promise, feel free to input in this. This is like what we've learned about Hong Kong's history over the last month or so. So yeah.
Exactly. So as you guys who've seen us before know, we're not historians and we're not specialists. But what we like to do is go away and research topics and then, and try to break it down and try to digest it and then share it. So for me, this story, I did get really interested in Hong Kong, not only because of the news coverage and the protests, but also because of something that I learned at our previous teach-in with Nick Robbins on the East India Company, and on particular the Opium Wars, which is where I'm going to start this story. So I'm sure many of you have got an idea of what Hong Kong is. Some of you might have been there already on holiday or known people who have, and you've probably got an image of, skyscrapers, financial center, busy metropolitan hub, maybe set against, a tropical climate in southeastern China with boats and beaches. Some of you who may know more will know that it's one of the most densely populated areas in the world, and often kind of compared to New York in that respect. But I'm going to take us way back a few hundred years to when Hong Kong was a very different place. 20 villages and hamlets, and European powers start traveling there to trade with the Qing dynasty. And you've got the Portuguese, Dutch, French, many local traders, and of course the British East India Company. But by the mid-1800s, the Chinese are actually far, far less interested in what the Europeans have to sell than the Europeans are in Chinese products, the silk, and in particular the teas, until they find a product that they can start selling into China, and that is the opium that they've started to grow in Bengal. And so, much to the kind of anger of Chinese officials, the British East India Company start aggressively trading in opium. And so the emperor in the mid 1800s decides to put a halt to this, thoroughly alarmed by the impact of this drug crisis, the impact of opium on society, and of course, that all the silver is being drained away. So they decide to ban the trade in opium and triggering what we all, or many of us might know as the Opium Wars, the first Opium War. I won't go into too much detail about that, but the emperor sort of quickly surrendered in that war, and Hong Kong, or parts of it, were ceded to the British, beginning the British colonial era of Hong Kong in 1841. I think this story is interesting because it's certainly not what I thought of when I first heard of the Opium Wars. I didn't think it was China trying to put a stop to the British trading in opium. So that was new when Nick taught me. But that triggered, that started this British colonialism in Hong Kong, which we're going to talk much more about. I guess before handing over, I just wanted to think a little bit about what that meant culturally for this area from 1840 to 1997. A British colony means not only that extractive economy, with the centre being in Britain, but it also means British culture. It means British schools. It means British institutions. It means the plugs are British. It means that you drive on the left side of the road. It means that you, in many ways, grow up around British cultural references. And that is, I just wanted to kind of start that off and set that scene for what it means to be a colony, not just economically, but also culturally. And now, Rihanna, do you want to pick up on where I left off?
Cool. So, yeah, I think so. It's really important to hold that date of 1997 in mind because essentially, with this deal, Britain had promised that they would return most of the territories that make up current day Hong Kong back to China. So 1997 is now there as some kind of like deadline. But at that time, Britain was like, we're not thinking about 100 years time. So we're just gonna take what we can now and deal with 1997 when it comes. So that happens. And then Hong Kong is kind of developing. It's got, but really the story kind of starts again with the World War II. And in World War II, Japan takes over Hong Kong. And I believe that this time was a time where there was quite a lot of brutality as well under the Japanese rule. And this was 4 years under Japanese rule. And when World War II came back to power, ended, when World War II ended, it wasn't entirely clear that Britain was going to take Hong Kong back. So China at that point could have had a claim that Britain and China were fighting together as allies in this war, and China could have taken it back. But instead, China decided it's also better to leave Hong Kong as a British colony for now, up until 1997, because Hong Kong was becoming quite a useful financial place for China. So China could do a lot of business within Hong Kong, so this happened. Then after the war, there was a civil war in China, and by 1949, the communists took over China. And this meant that a lot of people started fleeing from mainland China into the island of Hong Kong. And between this time, I believe that the population tripled. So it went to in the millions of people. And it's described as like many refugees came into Hong Kong, but I think the word refugee also conjures up one idea of what this kind of person was. But a lot of these people were coming also from Shanghai. A lot of these people were wealthy business people, landowners. They'd been running massive businesses in China. So these people also arrived into Hong Kong and started setting up shop there and running their businesses there and almost becoming, creating an elite with the British elites there as well, kind of doing their businesses. And so at this time, you've kind of got this island, there's China, it's becoming very communist, but there's this island of free economy and a huge amount of new labor. So lots of millions of people who are there to work, and a lot of people who are capitalizing on this existence. So they start building massive factories. And I believe I've been seeing like quotes saying that Hong Kong became at that point the factory of the world. It was producing a ton of goods, plastics, watches, clothes, textiles, huge amounts of factories were being built. But there was also just like really bad workplace conditions. So people were working, I've read like 14-hour days, 16-hour days. They could be fired in a day if the business wasn't there. They were living really precariously, whilst also the Hong Kong as we know it was being created, this like skyscrapers and wealth and all of this stuff was happening. So I think, you have this kind of this boom and this interesting migration that a lot of millions of people had moved into this island at this time. So that's some points. Promise, do you have anything to add at this point in terms of what was going on?
No, this is great. Yeah, I think one note is that I think a reason why the 70s is important and kind of part of the reason why I decided to focus on it was precisely because this generation that Rihanna was just talking about, right, of people that kind of immigrated from that post World War II era. This is really the kind of coming of age moment, right, for what is really the first kind of broadly speaking, there's kind of a cultural consciousness for what it means to live and grow up and to be born in Hong Kong, right? It's the kind of immediate descendants of people who migrated. And yeah, I think that's a really important context too, as the 70s is really kind of last decade before Hong Kong starts transitioning into that kind of big financial hub that we see today. And things are getting kind of more deindustrialized, right? Starting around later in that decade. So there's a lot of kind of shifts going on as what it means to be kind of a Hong Konger continues to be what really first became a discourse, right, for folks to think about. So, because I think that in the research really surprised me. I think you kind of assume the people there are the people who've been there for hundreds of years, but many of the people and their descendants are those who fled in the 50s and the 40s into this island and kind of were the workers and the elites that made it what it is today. And so I think then the big kind of juncture that came is that in 1967 there was a massive protest. It's described as a riot, all of these words, and this seems to be like a massive part of Hong Kong's history as well, and the context for a few years later the students who created the magazine that Promise wrote about. So yeah, in 1967 it seems to have started with a small labor dispute. So from what I read, it was the plastic factories. People were making plastic flowers, and the workplace conditions were really awful, and people started to speak out against their workplace conditions. And then the owner of the factory said, okay, I'm going to fire all of you tomorrow, or something along these lines. And this led into massive strikes, and and this was being encouraged by many left-wing communist people who were being inspired by what's going on in China with the Cultural Revolution. They were coming there and organizing these workers into mass protests. It spilled into the streets, and there was also a huge amount of police brutality. And yeah, this is to note, this was the British colonial regime kind of defending the economic system at that time. And the police were coming out, but the police often were also Chinese or from Hong Kong as well. But there were many deaths, there were many on both sides, police dying, protesters dying as well. And the thing that also freaked me out when I was reading was that afterwards,
Queen Elizabeth, like literally the Queen, she said they had done a very good job, I guess, and named them the Royal Police Force, gave them that honor after this strike. So yeah, this is kind of context for what's happening. However, public mood starts to shift. So it seems like at the first time, people were feeling very angry at the police, angry at the British state, and a lot of the anger was being directed towards the bosses and towards British states. But as the communist influence within China started to grow, there started to be bombings, there started to be a lot of chaos happening, and people started to turn against this movement. And I think this, promise you may be able to talk more on this, but yeah, it seems like this leads to splits in terms of what it means to be left, or how people related to what was happening in China. So yeah, that's some of the stuff that we learned.
So should we just go now straight into that 1970s and sort of, yeah, what does it mean to be left in that moment? And maybe promise, that's exactly where we'd love to hear from you. What does it mean to be left in 1970s Hong Kong?
Right, sure. So yeah, I think this is a great note to kind of transition, right? So I think the 1967 riots were a really important moment, and it's also sadly an important moment in which I think the reputation of the left, so-called, really really kind of sunk in an important way, right? Because there wasn't really kind of, there are massive protests, labor strikes, and stuff like that all throughout colonial history, very militant ones, right? But there hasn't really been quite kind of like kind of the seeds of a social movement. I mean, there was a sailor strike in the 20s, but really 67 was really important because I think people now saw that there's there can be kind of an organized left opposition, and that's somehow kind of obscurely related to what's going on in China. And so I think I think I was talking about this with random bombs setting off, and I think the actions got a little bit militant, just like how it was in the Cultural Revolution. And yeah, I think that traumatized a lot of people in the city, just as the kind of police brutality did traumatize people, right? So I think the 70s moment was really kind of social movements kind of regrouping and thinking, yeah, like, okay, how can we what does it mean to do local activism, right? What does it mean to talk about anti-imperialism, anti-capitalism, to organize under the British Empire, right? In the wake of this kind of complicated juncture where these people were still figuring out what the Chinese Communist Party is, and also, right, on the other hand, like what does it mean to be part of Hong Kong and the Hong Kong identity? So should I go into kind of why I wrote the article? And
yeah, although I did want to ask you as well, just because I thought it was interesting when we spoke just the journeys of your family as well. So I think it might illustrate some of the migration movements that we were talking about as well.
Yeah, so yeah, it's slightly complicated, and I think just growing up a bit more comfortable in one set of family, I think having the privilege in terms of some of this migration history too. But yeah, I was born and raised in Hong Kong, and I spent the first kind of 12 years of my life actually going back and forth between Hong Kong and LA for kind of following kind of my dad and him trying to do business stuff and things like that at the time. So I was evenly split between kind of going to school in Hong Kong and also growing up in Los Angeles. So that was a kind of interesting kind of experience. And I settled in the United States since that point after middle school or so, but I still go back every summer usually. Yeah, so my grandparents, like from my dad's side, came from the mainland, right? This is about two generations ago from me, and it was very working class. He had like a barbershop and things like that, and they kind of made their living from that point. And I think and then my mom's side was also like I think they were a bit more based in Hong Kong for a longer time, but also I think there's a bit of a migration history, and it wasn't really only until kind of my parents' generation and this is kind of the 70s generation I was talking about too. We're really the first generation that was kind of born and raised in Hong Kong, right? That have to grapple with Hong Kong identity being a local, right, in that sense. And of course, they also immigrated to the United States later on in their life. And so I think the interesting thing is almost like every generation I can think of in the last few generations have been a story of migration in their own ways, right? From mainland to Hong Kong to the United States. And then I found myself as kind of in the middle of, like, I'm like Hong Kong and United States. And
right, in that
so yeah,
transition.
right, yeah. So I think it's 3 generations of people living through very different Hong Kongs, right? Like grandparents as immigrants to Hong Kong, and then parents growing up in Hong Kong, moving away from Hong Kong, and me and between all these things, and really me being the first one to live kind of really totally under, right, after the handover in Chinese rule, right, with the experience of this kind of post-colonial condition. And so yeah, Hong Kong is this kind of interesting in between place, and that's kind of my history.
Nice. Yeah.
Yeah.
And then, yeah, do you want to, explain what drew you to thinking about this 1970s, and why did you want to discuss this history given the context we've just shared? Yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, yeah, like going back to what's going on in the last year or so, right? Like everyone's seen a lot of stuff in the news. There's kind of an overwhelming surge of information. I think one thing that was really important to me is that is to unpack this narrative that whatever is going on in Hong Kong is a monolith. It's not. It's a very diverse movement, and it's a very diverse history. That's not just you're pro Communist Party or you're pro the British colonial rule, right? There's a lot of gradient in between, and I think yeah, I want to reject this false binary of Western freedom fighters versus Chinese authoritarianism, right? Because then British colonial rule is real, and I think has very concrete effects that a lot of people have different interpretations of, even in this current movement. Coming from my perspective, and I know some folks in Lausan Collective, right? For us, it's more about establishing the continuity between British colonial mechanisms, right, that were in Hong Kong, and how they were appropriated and taken up by the Chinese government, by Beijing, after the handover. I mean, the Hong Kong police force is a really great example, right? It's so much of that is completely the same, right? It's really just an exchange of flag and some slight shifts in the upper ranks or something. But so much of it is, it's British tear gas, it's U.S. tear gas. There's literal colonial police officers who are still kind of in these upper echelons of these things. And so yeah, I think the 70s is a really great moment to look at also a very complicated moment in Hong Kong history, right, where we're still trapped between these different powers. But it's also, I think the thing that I really want to focus on is the similarities and differences between these two social movements, right? There's a big anti-imperialist kind of upsurge, right, in the 70s. There are the so-called Senkaku Islands or Diaoyutai Islands, depending on where you're seeing this from, Japan, Taiwan, or Hong Kong. China's trying to claim sovereignty over these kind of islands, and Japan also, and Japan was kind of backed by the U.S. and Taiwan was also involved. So yeah, it's Hong Kong is always in this kind of complicated situation where it's trapped between all these global geopolitical actors. And at the time, the sentiment was definitely from the activist movement was very anti-U.S., anti-British colonialism. But what is the framework, right? What is the ideological framework from which to view that? Should we go to this kind of insurgent, communist, Chinese-backed phenomenon that's going on in some of the work, in some of the factories and in some social movements and student groups, or do we have to do our own thing? And what does doing our own thing mean? Are we Chinese people under British colonial rule? Are we Hong Kongers? So all these things are kind of bubbling up, right? In a very different but actually weirdly similar way from people talking about Hong Kong identity today, right? Like who are we as Hong Kongers? And this kind of turn to what people call localism now, right? This focus on Hong Kongers' interests and things like that, right? It's framed very differently from the 70s. But I think the thing that was really interesting to me was the 70s were really the first generation where a whole generation of youth grew up under this kind of British colonial rule, right? Where that's their parents mostly migrated from mainland, and they're the ones who are growing up under this colonial government and trying to figure out their own identities. And today, right, it's similarly, but also very differently. It's a very first generation of people like me and younger who fully grew up under the Chinese regime, right, under a very specific constellation of capitalist exploitation and also post-colonial condition. And people are trying to find their own voice in this particular conditions in very different ways and very different backdrops. The thing that was really interesting to me in the 70s, obviously coming as a leftist, is the fact that why are ideological debates we're so prominent and we're able to really surface so much in the 70s, while it feels like the political possibilities are kind of foreclosing as we speak, right, in the wake of the national security laws, right, and even throughout the movement, right, so much is focused on tactics and what we can do, but not but there isn't really a lot of room for what kind of political future we want beyond the 5 demands, beyond we want to vote, because so much of it feels so sad, but also like yeah, like I think people feel that, there's not a lot of room to imagine what kind of political system we want beyond. We just need a vote and things like that. And to me, the 70s represent an interesting moment where people are rigorously having, and again, not to say people aren't having these conversations today, but it's a very specific kind of left anti-imperial framework in the 70s, right? Where people grappling with the British legacy and what does self-determination mean, right? Self-determination really kind of came out of these political debates from students and workers, right, in the 70s. What does independence mean? Like, should we even be talking about that? And these things really kind of came alongside discussions of strategies, right, and how to oppose the British government and police brutality in the streets. I'm really interested in this kind of combination of tactics and ideological discussion that are going on this kind of organizing. And I do want to briefly flag that, zines and youth publications have been at the forefront, right, of a lot of these super rigorous political debates from the 70s to today. And I am definitely not totally the expert to talk about zines today and things like that, but I do have to say, I think in terms of rigorous political thought and demands and things like that, I think those are very clearly experimented upon and thought about through these kind of flyers in Hong Kong, even the last year, that mainstream media just doesn't really pick up on. And,
I think that's what really drew me to this whole, like Rihanna said, the visual of these zines is so, so inspiring, so comic at times. It's really appealing, and so you may have seen some of the images and some of the marketing for this event, but that zine culture, I think, is what really drew me to this moment. But I want people to really understand what you meant just now by the kind of political imagination that these zines expressed in the 70s, but what maybe is missing today in the focus on tactics. I think it's not entirely clear, so it'd be really nice to kind of unpack that for the guys listening.
Actually, just a short side note, but I'll drop this later in the link, but I think there's a really great article by someone named Rachel Lau who in Vancouver, who really reported on a lot of the amazing Hong Kong zine subculture stuff in the last year. And I could throw in a link later too, and there's a lot of great interviews there and that. Nice. But yeah, to respond to that question, I think what was really important in the 70s, that's still right, that's obviously still connected today, is from the 70s Biweekly zine that I focused on. That's a kind of constellation of anarchists, socialists, and progressives and stuff like that. Is this kind of distrust of the Chinese Communist Party, right? And I think that one thing that was really important that connected to some of the things you're saying before in the Opium Wars was actually the Bengali genocide, right, in 1971, the West Pakistan genocide under the leadership of Yahya Khan. When they massacred people in East Pakistan when they're trying to fight for their own liberation. And the fact that China actually majorly backed the U.S. and the West Pakistan regime to slaughter Bengalis in East Pakistan, or what we call Bangladesh today, was really important for 70s Biweekly. And there's a whole special issue on it, right, where it's this particular moment where it's like, okay, we need an alternative, but then the alternative is something it's blatantly betraying, right, what we see as our anti-imperial ideal. And at the same time, this is where a lot of the Chinese dissidents, right, excluded from the Communist Party, really kind of got in contact with activists in Hong Kong. And so there's this kind of particular connection where it's like, we need to create something anew, right? And that old models don't, even old leftist paradigms, right, and that are kind of prominent in that new left era, might not actually fit, right? Some of these so-called third worldist or Maoist models, and it's kind of a call to create something anew, right, based on these frameworks of radical democracy and anti-imperialism. I think today, what the problem now is that, and especially with the handover, the CCP has successfully kind of really monopolized what it means to be in the left. So if you go out in the streets and you talk to someone, just everyday protesters even, right, and you say the left, right, it's like what they think of is not labor unions, what they think of is not, liberatory struggles. It's like the Chinese Communist Party, which is to them the kind of symbol of authoritarian repression, literally before they were even born or as they were, coming of age, right? Yeah. And I think decades of British and Chinese neoliberal policies, right, has kind of atomized the society to really create this kind of mass movement discourse, let alone, right, letting that identified to what the left even means.
So I think, again, this
yeah.
is pretty complicated stuff, but it is, to me, I think what I needed to do to get my head around it is really take seriously the inequality that exists in Hong Kong today, which honestly shocked me when I was doing this research. I had that image of skyscrapers and financial center in my mind. And I mean, logically, I knew that that meant that there are, you know, different classes of people, but it's not the image that comes to mind. But the inequality in Hong Kong is one of the worst globally, in the research and the especially reading your articles. The Gini coefficient, which is one of these measures of relative wealth within a country, you know, puts Hong Kong in the same bracket as Colombia, as Honduras, as South Africa, as Botswana. And that, again, as a leftist today, you've got to take that kind of relative inequality and relative wealth really seriously, rather than pay attention to the GDP figures that are banded around as an indicator of how well a country's doing and what that must mean for the people's experiences in that country. So given that inequality, Promise, and what the work, you know, what it means to have a workers' movement in that situation, how should we understand the protests and the struggles today? That's a very hard question, but
yeah.
I think one other thing, I think it was quite interesting when we spoke about how the working class, like in Hong Kong, has changed since the time you were writing about in the 70s to now, and how you were saying to me it's a lot more freelance, there's a lot of freelancers and a lot of people who are, the factories have gone, but there's still this massive amount of inequality and migrant workers as well. And how does that fit into, yeah, what's going on?
Yeah, sorry, okay, that's a lot, so I'm gonna try to I'll start with, again, like continue with what I said just now. I think it's hard to have a workers' movement in Hong Kong. It's definitely kind of pessimistic and hard. And a lot of it is, again, due to the fact that there hasn't really been the same social movement history, and so much of, you know, the left, or left discourse has been kind of monopolized, right, by state repression, even though it's blatantly kind of capitalist, right? I think that has caused a kind of obstacle, right, for people to plug into some of the things we take sometimes for granted. And some of our milieus, in terms of like, yeah, this is social movement building, and this is the left, this is what it means to be progressive, and those things don't really kind of register the same way. And I think, again, the very heightened inequality and neoliberal oppression has made it, and frankly, the lack of workers' protection, right, has made it very, very difficult to build a movement on class solidarity, even though, right, and this alludes to the kind of elephant in the room, that actually, you know, the best tactic probably, right, for Hong Kong protesters is to link up with the kind of very inequitable conditions also in mainland China, and workers and dissidents there. But, you know, it's a very deliberate strategy, right, in terms of both, right, Chinese government amping up nationalist sentiments, and also from the movement, right, when it gets this, when this focus on Hong Kong identity and self-determination gets way too, it turns even ethno-nationalist at a certain point, right? It's like we're separate from Chinese people, and I think all these impulses, right, make this, you know, what I think is a generally more effective movement strategy very difficult. But at the same time, like what Rihanna was saying, you know, there's an upsurge also actually of new unions that are popping up in the last just half a year, where you've seen workers from these different sectors that never unionized before, where it's using unions as a political strategy, right? And, you know, there's no tradition with, you know, traditional, you know, union rank and file workers building effort, but, you know, more than 60, 70 new sectors unionized, right, from dental equipment producers to dancers and freelancers, you know, this kind of new precarious working class that usually doesn't see itself as working class, and probably still doesn't. But this is kind of an important moment, I think, you know, to keep uplifting and highlighting those efforts. But still, at the end of the day, I think the framework that's probably most effective, and that's on people's mind, is this kind of ambiguity of self-determination. And I think that's the thing I kind of want to focus on, or at least
let's
get
do
folks
that.
thinking
Yeah,
about.
let's focus on that in the last few minutes.
Yeah, because I think that's really, it's extremely undefined, right? It's like, are we Hong Kongers, are we Chinese, or what's you know, should we side with the British? You know, it's like these things are all really still in flux, right? Because of Hong Kong's unique kind of migration condition, and also the current global climate. It's always been my position that this is a strength and a weakness. I think it's going to be impossible to plot like Lenin or something or whatever traditional left analysis of self-determination and nationhood on these things. Partly not only because of Hong Kong, right? I think because of the global conditions. I think we could say some similar thing with Hong Kong, Kashmir, Xinjiang, where it's so complex, right? And you can't really just slot that into national liberation struggle. You could just take some old leftist framework and put on it. I think this is a strength. I think the fact that people are figuring it out still and there's no clear direction. Obviously, it's a weakness in the sense of like, okay, but we need kind of answers fast as things are being clamped down now. So, I think, in the 70s moment or even an 80s moment, right, from people who came out of that 70s history, actually had thought about these questions of self-determination, right? Not in an exclusionary way, in a way that means, it's centered on Hong Kongers' right to speak and determine our own material conditions, right? And that, questions of like, okay, but like racialization or ethnicization or what's the relationship between us and mainlanders. I think folks actually in the 70s and 80s from this anti-imperial moment actually, had a chance to kind of explore these questions and think of self-determination in a way that connects to struggles in mainland or Taiwan and stuff. I think this is one thing that, obviously we can't, again, put on this current moment, but I think it's an interesting way to think about self-determination in a very radically democratic and still undefined way, right? That there are lessons that we can learn now. And the last note I can kind of end on that question is, I think it's, is when third worldism or third world nationalism, right, doesn't provide the answers that activists want, and what type of future do we need? And it's always been a persuasion that, I think we need a kind of even anti-nationalist or transnational movement, right, especially centered around Asian and Black identities, POC movements that we need to reimagine differently from the third world past. And again,
what do you mean by third world nationalism?
Yeah, it was in the 60s and 70s moment. And I was going to drop a book recommendation too by Adam Getachew. She's a scholar in the United States who wrote this book called World Making After Empire. And she focused on, these movements in the 60s and 70s, right, where it's these kind of left-wing national movements that are anti-colonial movements responding to British rule. And she's, also pointing out the fact that, and this is the note I want to keep kind of pressing, right? And the thing she does really well in the book is that actually, there are elements of these national projects that point beyond simply national boundaries, that point beyond simply, what Nyerere was doing or what Nkrumah or Cabral was doing in their own respective countries, right? And these leaders and these movements have visions that point outwards. And I think this is where I want to drop with, I think the Black liberation movement has been extremely important and provides a series of critical dialogues that's really important for me and for I think Hong Kongers to think through, right? That can go beyond nationalism, beyond kind of strict identity formations, and yeah, there's a lot to go into there. So
there's a lot. There's a lot.
Yeah.
Right. I think something that I've taken away. I don't, I can't say that I fully follow everything you're saying now and the entire article, but something that I took away with me that maybe others might be able to resonate with is that we've got a very narrow understanding of what colonialism and nationalism or self-determination is, and it's framed by this nation state idea. And so if a foreign country has invaded and is occupying, that's colonialism, and if that country then becomes independent, that's decolonization. And this story of Hong Kong really complicates that in lots of different ways, and how you've described just now, in terms of that, I think, kind of international solidarity when it comes to these liberation movements. Also related to our discussion on capitalism in terms of if colonialism is an economic system as much as a political system, who continues to own those material resources and the land once that foreign country has left. All that to say, colonialism is never straightforward, and the Hong Kong story really throws that up, not least because it's caught between this British colonialism and Chinese imperialism, but also because of the economic system. And the answers are not straightforward, which is what you just kind of described. and you're quite optimistic about that. That you know, you don't know, there's no straight.
Yeah. I mean, I'll end on this brief note too. I think in terms of optimism or pessimism, I think the thing I got from the 70s movement that's important today is that history is not linear. And what we see in the story of Hong Kong social movements is a story of different important generations of people revisiting a same question of what self-determination means, right? When workers and everyday people don't control, you know, our own political destiny and what it means to just be in the city and have freedoms, right? And each generation is having the same debate, but in very, very different terms, right? I mean, now it's about Hong Kong nationalism and the umbrella movement, and now it's a totally different thing. And then there's also this whole left and anti-imperial discourse on self-determination. And yeah, I think that's the kind of blurry note I want to kind of end on is yeah, I think that is part of the democratic project, right, of Hong Kongers self-making, right, is the fact that, you know, people are gathering together in very, very different circumstances to think about what it means to be Hong Kong in very, very different ways, right? And there are exclusionary potentials that we must combat as leftists, and there are also liberatory potentials that we should uplift. And I think these are really exciting openings. And if there's one lesson from the 70s is that people need to create things anew, and there's no blueprint or framework in the past that you can totally kind of take from. And, you know, protesters today are at the front lines of you know, this rigorous political thinking. And yeah.
Oh, thank you. I wondered, Mira, if you would let me show you very quickly some of the photos just to visualize, or shall we end on time?
Up to you.
I will briefly show, because I think it might be quite nice just to visualize some of the stuff that we talk about as well. And then we can, yeah, show it. One sec. Because I want to show the... So this was a picture of Hong Kong in the 60s, as we were talking about, with just like the boom, the very quick like buildings and all of this stuff. And here are some images of people migrating and the ways that people were living as well. So as we were talking about, this was the people, the first generation, one of the first generations, and their children who were creating what it meant to be Hong Kongers. These were like the factories that we mentioned in terms of where people were working and the conditions that people were fighting up against in the 60s. And just some images of the British police force and yeah, what was happening there. So and then I thought, here are the magazines. So I think if people want to learn more, it would be really amazing to read some of Promise's articles and just research more about the 70s Biweekly and some of the things. Yeah, Promise, I don't know if you quickly want to say what these images are.
Yeah, we actually have
yeah.
Richard Ollington, one of our viewers, is really into the photos. So let's
sure, yeah.
Let's tell him a little bit more.
Yeah, so these are from a friend's book in Hong Kong. It's just about, I think it's a book about like prisons or police or something, a colonial era. And yeah, some of the photos here are these are some of the 70s Biweekly members actually, who were arrested and helping to lead a kind of anti-imperialist protest about those islands I was talking about. And yeah, actually, you know, the person on the very left of the photo, right under police exceeded authority, that's the person being arrested there is Mo Chiu, Augustin Mock, and he's actually still around. He's like doing kind of theater stuff now, and he's still kind of in Hong Kong doing arts and theater things. And yeah, here's just people getting arrested and fighting on the streets.
Yeah. This was an image of some of the founding members, I think, of the magazine in the 70s.
Yeah, I think this one's a bit broader too. I'm not sure, yeah, the exact, but because there is a constellation of so many different forces: Maoists, progressives, liberals, Christians, 70s Biweekly anarchists, like in that movement. So I think this one's a broader one, but yeah, could be them.
And then this is the last picture I had from your article, which I just thought was like a really cool picture. But I think it was, is it taken in France? And this is some of the kind of leftist activists or
I'm
French
not
people.
Sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
I need to. This picture has quite a history just because I got it from it was a photocopy from a book.
Okay.
That the biographer got from one of the original people, and I think it's like we like half the people aren't really identified or something yet. But yeah, this is part of the 70s Biweekly editorial team, and like I was saying, at a certain point, you know, some of these people went over to France to to labor, to work and to odd jobs to fund the magazine, and met with socialists in the UK. It was, yeah, there was a kind of interesting history there. I kind of alluded to in my article.
Yeah.
But, yeah.
Nice, cool. So Mira, yeah, do you want to wrap up? And
I'm glad you did that. And
yeah,
let's, as usual, after this, we're going to share some resources with you guys to keep reading and keep listening, and more photos maybe to look at, because I do think it brings it all to life. So we've kept you till 10:02. Thank you all for staying with us.
Thank you. Thank you, Promise, massively for joining us.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thanks for having me.
Time goes so fast, but yeah, I think we will continue the conversations and like just like solidarity as well to everything that's happening in Hong Kong, and like people should really look up what's going on, the national security law, like educate yourself on what's happening and how we can support from outside as well. Yeah. Absolutely. Okay.
Great point to end on. So thank you all so much for your time.
Thank you. Bye.